is that there are actually 4 stages in which we can see this functioning. And this is a very simplified version of what actually happens in the production process and the circulation process, just for the purposes of illustration. So we have the stage of production, selection, distribution, reception. Production is rather obvious. It is the stage at which the author or group of authors, or indeed the animation team, as Ian was speaking about yesterday, create a particular work. The process of selection is one which is often neglected or not studied, but is also very important. It's the process whereby editors in publishing houses will decide which works are published, which are not published, of all the works that are submitted to them, as well as if there are certain images or parts of anime of a particular series that they will cut, that they will not include in the final distributed version. So in the case of this, program directors in TV stations, studio executives will make these kinds of decisions. The stage of distribution, well, again, you understand how this works. So it takes place, in the case of bookstores, on the internet, DVDs, TV networks, movie theaters in the case of anime. And the stage of reception, which is one that is, of course, very important. And here we can talk about this in great detail, but I just want to speak about the role of interpretive communities, which is to say, if you want, fandom, fan groups. How do they actually receive the works? How do they code them? What kind of value do they assign to them? And that process of coding and valuing these works becomes very important in how works are received by a general public. Because initially, of course, it usually stands by smaller communities who receive these works, and then if they are successful, they become broadcast to larger communities as we go along. All right, so since I've already heard the first bell, moving along, again, a great deal to say about this, but let's turn to the next thing. Now, the final slide is simply the idea of the iconographic field. And here what I want to do is to bring together internalist and externalist perspectives. And I want to talk about this in relationship to Bourdieu's field theory. So many of you are familiar with the work of Gail Bourdieu, and classically you will see these kinds of field distributions with different positions along the field. I didn't actually fill out the field with different positions because it would take an actual empirical study, which I haven't done, about the way, the positionality of different works of manga or anime in relationship to each other. But the key idea of a notion of field is twofold. Firstly, there's a notion of what we could call relationality, which is to say that a work of manga or an anime series cannot be understood on its own, but it has to be understood in relation to other works against which it is in competition, and also in some instances in relations of complementarity. So a work must be understood in relationship to the field within which it exists, of other works within which it exists and it is positioned. That's the first thing. And the other principle that's important within a field is the principle of what we could call hierarchical differentiation, which is to say that there are differences established between different positions within a field, but those positions are always hierarchical. There are attempts by the producers of works or by audiences to establish the superiority of their particular preferences, of the particular works that they like in relationship to other works that they dislike or devalue. So having said this, when we look at the iconographic field, there are 2 axes along which we can think. The horizontal axis, which is that of symbolic capital, is much more conventionally Bourdieusian in its analysis. In other words, if we understand the value of different works, it is the prestige of those works or of the authors themselves, the standing that they have that is attributed to them. It could also be related to the idea of the kind of social or cultural capital which audiences that receive these works have. So for instance, if a particular work wins a prize, a manga prize, then of course its symbolic capital increases dramatically. If certain types of fan communities receive a work very well, again, the standing or credibility of the work goes up. But again, if it happens that they reject the worth of a particular work, then again, its symbolic capital, its value goes down. So we have to understand this as moving, but also understand that a work is seen as having a lot of cultural capital in relationship to one that has less cultural capital, and so on and so forth, or in the case of this rather symbolic capital. Now, the other part of the iconographic field I want to suggest, and this is much less Bourdieusian because it focuses actually on the internal content and aesthetic value of the work, has to do with what kind of aesthetic genre is a work of manga or anime focused upon. So we can talk about a kind of opposition between what I call expressionism and realism. Expressionism being a tendency, and most manga is actually related in that part of the field towards an expressionist style of aesthetic representation, which is based mostly on a notion of, let's say, a more graphic or explicit representation of emotions, of the feelings of the main actors in the work. But there's also works, as you all know, that are more realist, that tend to be more restrained in the display of emotion through images and the way in which the text speaks or describes the action and the way in which the action works. So what I want to say is that, again, we have to understand works as being more expressionist or more realist, not in absolute terms, but in relative terms, in relationship to each other. That these terms don't exist on their own, they only exist in opposition and in comparison to each other. They are relative terms in that way. So I'm just going to wrap up here, second bell. The last point that I want to make, just in conclusion, is that when we speak about iconographic fields, we have to understand that there is no such thing as a single one. In other words, there is no universal iconographic field by which we can say all manga will be read by all audiences in the same way, or will be classified as having more or less symbolic capital, or more or less of a kind of expressionism. It depends, or a kind of realism. It depends very much on the historical, the social cultural context within which these things are read. And so what this means essentially is that it's always possible that audiences in different contexts will see a work as having more symbolic capital than audiences in Japan will, or will see a work as being more realist or more expressionist than audiences in Japan will. And what we have to understand is, how do these processes of translation work? How is it that a work that gains more prestige in Japan may acquire, that prestige may translate overseas, in Italy, in France, in the US, or how is it that that prestige may not translate? In other words, how is it that a work may never be translated, even though it may have a great deal of prestige? How is that process of selection established, and how do audiences read those things over time? So, thank you for your time.
Thank you.